So with that thought, Katharine Crouan, please.
Good evening. Rainbow's End. I need to put it on the screen. No? Right. It's a bit of a blurry image, but I hope you can see it. It's not about the famine, but I can tell you it fixes on exactly the same themes. The forgotten corpse, the anonymous, meaningless death, the isolation of dying, issues that you see in so many of that fine collection from Quinnipiac. Bill would have thought it was an honour to be part of that collection, just as I find it an honour to be here this evening speaking on his behalf. But my purpose in this little presentation isn't to generalise about art or the famine. I'd be very ill-equipped to do either, you'll be relieved to hear. But I want to show you how he approached the depiction of pretty well the darkest aspects of the human condition, and how he used landscape, which very frequently in the history of art is regarded as an intrinsically conservative genre, as a vehicle to be subverted, even to be slightly radical. But let's start with Rainbow's End. It was painted in, we think, 1970 in London. The artist was 40. He was in mid-career. His background is well known. He was born and raised on the west coast of Scotland into a family that considered itself as Irish as it was Scottish, his parental family coming from Northern Ireland, from County Antrim. Bill grew up in a sectarian working-class society. He was educated at Glasgow School of Art, and the minute he graduated, he left for Paris. He lived in Dublin in the 50s, lived for a period in Spain in the 60s, but it's fair to say that he made his reputation in London. And by the age of 30, he was considered one of the young Turks, one of the young British artists of the time. Great critical acclaim followed, lots of sales, one of the most exciting young artists in London. But by the age of 40, things were definitely more complicated. Now, if you try to pick out what was the key element of Bill's growing up, which seemed to affect the rest of his life and which has a bearing on this evening's subject, it is being at the age of 15, sitting in the local cinema in Troon in Ayrshire and seeing the newsreel of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Allied troops. Bill was aware at the time, and ever afterwards it seemed, of the enormity of what he was seeing. And at the time he said he felt ashamed because he was unable to deal emotionally or intellectually with the horror of it. And the Holocaust led him to search for a philosophy or some form of moral code that would enable him to deal with the senselessness of it all, the banality of evil, as Arendt called it. And he found it in existentialism, as many people did at that time. What did he mean by that? It meant that you junked any form of belief system, because the only defining characteristic of being human was the freedom to act, and on that you should be judged. Throughout his life, Bill's only article of faith was Jean-Paul Sartre's dictum, "You are the sum total of your actions." But the flip side of freedom is the tremendous responsibility it carries, which can produce its own terrors. With Sartre, Bill believed that it was the place of the artist to be engagé, that is, to be socially active and politically aware. That's not to be a political artist. Bill would have shuddered at the description. To be engagé is to be informed and involved. But what are the sources for the imagery in Rainbow's End? Well, there are many. photographs and films of the First World War and the Second World War. Lots of studies made from a medical school skeleton, and colour as ever in Crozier, which becomes ratcheted up to create a sort of an emotional intensity, almost a toxicity. Because if you think of heat and if you think of a decomposing body, you think of the whole process being accelerated, the body becoming part of the earth. And in Rainbow's End, if you look at that painting, that skeletal figure and the landscape inhabit the same space. They're indivisible. And it was entirely intentional on Bill's part. He said he wanted to create a landscape as a state of mind, in the sense that someone who's in a state of stress or in a state of isolation sees the world as a projection of themselves. And I think it's also very telling that the year before Rainbow's End was painted, Bill visited the site of the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen. And it was at least 7 years after that he's quoted in an interview saying, "The enormity of that horror I've still not fully dealt with." But think back to 1970, when the picture was painted. Bill didn't have to think back to World War II to be reminded of the atrocities of man's inhumanity. In 1970, he just had to look towards Northern Ireland. And here was a problem. Emotionally and spiritually, he thought of himself as Irish, but in actual fact, he was a British subject. This was a dilemma, and it created a profound psychological tension, which he only resolved by giving up his British passport and adopting Irish citizenship, which he did in 1973 and remained living in England. It was an act of deep conviction on his part, but I can tell you, it was regarded as at best romantic bravado by his friends, regarded as an outrage by his family, and with some distaste by some elements of the English art establishment. It's one thing to adopt Irish citizenship in 2018 because of Brexit, and quite another to do so in the circumstances of the Troubles in the 1970s. Now, I'm uncertain of the professional consequences that came from that, and I'm wary of establishing cause and effect. But I can tell you that Bill was never invited to show the skeleton paintings in any public or commercial venue in London or Edinburgh, though they were shown to great acclaim in Glasgow and Liverpool, the latter where they were hung in the Walker Art Gallery alongside work by Francis Bacon. But what strikes me, who met Bill shortly after this, was that his view of Ireland, based though it was on deep knowledge, love, reason, reading, was essentially the view from the diaspora, with all the romanticism that that implies. It's very different when you live here. And that, I think, is one great difference between Bill's work such as Rainbow's End and the landscape paintings that he created after 1984 in West Cork. We bought a house here in 1983. Although the figures disappeared from Crozier landscapes, he said, "I like my landscape subjects to have the feeling that man is just temporarily absent from the scene." And he used to get exasperated when people would say, in all good faith, "Bill, you should go to New England to look at the fall. You'd find the colour wonderful." And he'd say, "Why? It means nothing to me." But where better than in West Cork, where every field carries a story, to marry history with the visual? What we didn't know when we bought a house here, maybe we should have done, but the townland of Kilcoe and its surroundings witnessed some of the most abject, harrowing episodes of the famine and the years afterwards, and they're all documented by the parish priest. So how could the artist reconcile the historical landscape with empirical observed experience? How could he reconcile the history the landscape as a repository for history, with his exhilaration, visionary enjoyment of it. Well, the painting on the screen is called At the Crooked Bridge, and I think it's a good example of what he did. The other thing which occurred to us, and we could only gather this by living here, is that in the 1980s, Ireland itself was undergoing massive change. There was economic downturn, but at a local level here, the landscape itself was something dynamic. It wasn't static. It was being tempered by changing patterns of labour, ownership, just changed agricultural practice. And Bill wanted to understand all of it. He said, if I can't understand the economics of my neighbours, how can I paint their land with any conviction? And he loved listening to and quizzing his neighbours about the land. Why was that field being reclaimed? Why was the new grass a sharper colour? What was the price of a cow? There was even a brief period when he read the Irish Farmers Weekly, but he found it impenetrable. The painting on the screen is At the Crooked Bridge. Its subject is a piece of ground between Kilcoe and Ballydehob, and these days it's on the N71. But it was also, in the 1880s, the site of a murder of the landlord, Robert Kingston, by two local men. And it was a place that we often used to walk out and look at and visit for no reason other than Bill liked the shape of the rocks. But then he read in the Illustrated London News the history of this area. And he describes visiting it by himself after then. He said, the landscape seemed to set the emotional key of the scene. I beg your pardon. The landscape seemed to set the emotional key for the crime, if crime it was. And I knew I could make a painting which evoked a sense of tragedy, simply in the depiction of a familiar rough field. So that's history and the visual come together. I can barely see this, so apologies. But in 1995, the George Moore Society invited him to create a painting on the theme of the famine for the big exhibition they were curating to commemorate 150 years since 1845. And Bill submitted this painting, which is called Atlantic Island. It was based on the inspiration which came from Roaring Water Bay. And there are several island pictures around this time. But in this one, painted for the exhibition, the island in Roaring Water Bay has been simplified to become simply an icon of an island. All topographical reference has been abandoned in order to create this image of isolation and exile. It doesn't conjure up the literal horrors of Rainbow's End. It takes a much more stoical approach to tragedy. I'll end by saying how Bill Crozier described himself. He said, for convenience, I call myself a landscape painter. Landscape, though, is just the vehicle through which I can express intangible things: exile, longing, loss. I think the landscape, as much as the history of West Cork, allowed him to do just that. Thank you very much.